Hey guys, it's Upa here. So recently I got a question about someone asking how they should build their team, or more specifically they're asking what are some teams I could recommend, and I actually have seen this question being asked quite a few times before, and I don't really like answering that question because it's hard to give someone a specific team without any additional context. So there's questions like which area of content you're trying to complete, what stage in the game are you a spender or non-spender? Because, I mean, I could very easily give you a team like Apsara, Nicolith, Marie, Felicia, and like Beatrix or something, right? And that's obviously going to be an extremely strong direct damage team for maybe like Wuthering Coast or something. But obviously, not everyone will have access to the same set of characters, and I thought what would be more useful is rather explaining what your thought process should be when trying to form a team with the characters you have. So this is my methodology to go about doing this. I don't think there's a definite best way to go about doing this, but this is what I would suggest. So I think first of all, you need to identify what your main damage dealer is going to be. Or if you're very early into the game and don't have one, you also need to try and identify how you are going to get one. So let's talk about the early game part first. So let's say you don't have a damage dealer, you've summoned some legendaries and all you've gotten is complete rubbish. Then in the early game, chances are you should be getting a character like Mackin, right? You can get this early game from the Merit event store. I think it's called like the Sword Harbor event or something, but you have those heart tokens and there's a epic hero box where you can select Mackin from. I believe you can get 2 boxes of that. So in that case, Mackin would be your main damage dealer. But in other cases, maybe you're someone who re-rolled for a new account and instead you get something like Lance, maybe you got maybe something like Willam even, or Vasily. It doesn't really matter what the character is, could be Kratos as well. Just a character which, after you've done a bit of your own research, you've searched tier lists either on the Discord or my channel or other YouTube channels, is going to be a solid damaging character for your team. So once you have identified the main damage dealer for your team, so for example, let's just say Lance, then honestly, the rest of your team kind of just revolves around building around that specific character, right? So first of all, one mistake many players make, especially at the earlier stages, is they focus too much on damage and not enough on support. So on the early game, especially when you don't have enough food to max out 5 heroes at Awaken level 5, 1 damage dealer and 2 supports is more than enough. And eventually, this isn't a hard rule, but I guess something you can somewhat use as a rule of thumb. Generally, you would want to have about 2 damage dealers and then 3 supports. So just supports can come in different forms. So this could be shielders like Nordak, or it can be characters like Apsara. Obviously, Apsara's limited time hero, but Apsara which will damage record and increase your damage massively, right? But maybe on the more free-to-play or non-limited time hero side, support could also be someone which gives speed up too. So maybe in the early game also it could be someone like Space, or maybe if you have a direct damage dealer as your main damage dealer, maybe you have like Dharma or some other form of direct damage character, then a non-shielder support like Rista also works really well. So yeah, 2 damage dealers and 3 supports generally I think is a safe way to go about doing things. Sometimes you may even just have 1 damage dealer and 4 supports. That's pretty common with Marie teams, something like Apsara, Nicolith, Marie, and then maybe like Murungjing and like Rista or Beatrix or Esther. And that's just Marie being the sole damage dealer and everything goes into supporting her, right? So yeah, that's the most basic way I can explain it. And now let's talk about, more specific areas of content. So I think the main one in the earlier stages would be Tower of Mark, so let's talk about this first. And obviously you can only use one mark type of characters, right? So in this case, in the earlier stages, you will have very limited resources. Maybe you don't even have a single damage dealer for one specific mark. And when that happens, honestly, there isn't really much you can do, because if you don't have a decent, don't have any single legendary damage dealer to use, then on the epic side of things, there isn't really many good options, right? Mackin is honestly probably the only realistic epic damage dealer that you should be using. No one else really comes close. So sometimes in these instances, you simply just have to wait, and maybe that means you would be able to progress in this area of content. But I think there's a lot more breathing room when it comes to a lot of other areas of content, especially the earlier dungeons, or actually in fact all dungeons, since there's not any actual requirement for this. For dungeons, you kind of want to, once again, have your damage dealer, and I think in dungeons in particular, you need to have a larger focus on supports, because when you reach the higher stages, the boss actually does a lot of damage and you need to find ways to circumvent that, right? So maybe you could use something like Lance, and then for your supporters, Nordak, very good, obviously. That's why everyone tells you to get Nordak as your first mythic hero. And then at the earlier stages, you should always look for, once again, characters that buff your main damage dealer. So examples of supports which can apply for basically any damage dealer would be the ones which gives your team things like speed up 2. So Santa here is a very good one. Santa gives speed up 2 once you get him to exclusive 1. And before that, maybe if you don't have any better options, you can use Space, who is also very good in the early game as well, right? If you can find Space. She gives speed up 1, but in general, she is a very useful character. And then, once again, maybe we can just use, 1 DPS and 4 supports. It kind of depends what you have, but if you don't have any better options, you can use things like Catherine in the early stages. Of course, when it comes to specific damage types, you can look for better supports which synergize more well with your damage dealer. So in Lancer's case, he's a bleed type damage dealer, right? So we could look for a support which directly helps his bleed damage. So for example, we have Chardonnay over here, who not only gives a shield and speed up to 2 buffs, which I've mentioned already, which are both very good, but he also puts heavy bleed. So these are the kind of effects that you should be looking for on your supports. So for basically every damage type, there's going to be one which does a debuff on the enemy, which increases damage taken by 50%. And there will also be characters which give increase in damage dealt by your ally. So in this case, we have Morkis, who gives bleed up 2, right? So the combination of bleed up 2 and what we saw just now on our Chardonnay, which was deep bleed 2, both of which will massively, or heavy bleed 2, both of which will heavily, massively increase Lance's damage. Of course, if you're not using Lance, maybe you're using a poison damage dealer, then there will be the respective characters that will give these buffs. So for example, for poison, we have Kalana, who gives deep bleed, and then for poison up, I believe we have Imikado. If we take a quick look, poison up 2. And once again, for every damage type, there is this sort of buff. And then besides just, increasing the damage or increasing the damage the enemy takes, there are other ways to support your team, right? So Santa, as mentioned previously, one good way that he supports your team is not just through the shield, but through a special 4, which grants debuffs such as speed down 2 and freeze as well. So CC effects are very useful when dealing with waves, which is oftentimes a big limiting factor in dungeons. Of course, things like freeze and control effects don't tend to work on bosses, but sometimes, getting past the wave is actually more difficult than the boss itself. And besides that, there are so many more debuffs you can inflict on the enemy. For example, there are various characters which inflict attack down 2 and cold 2. You kind of just have to look through the characters you have, and also, more importantly, ask around or use various resources to check which characters are worth using, right? There could be characters which do inflict things like freeze, the effects, the various different debuffs or buffs I mentioned, but the characters itself may not be good, right? So I think if I just randomly look through some of these characters, we will see some of it. So for example, defense down 2, maybe that might be useful. Inflicts freeze as well, but no one is ever using this character, right? I didn't even know its name before seeing this. Amalek. Off we go, look at, Gunner over here. Gunner does Deep Burn 1, which is, still solid for burn and is pretty much what I mentioned earlier, right? But once again, Gunner is a character which in itself isn't very good, despite maybe some of the slightly good things that he does. So just some instances of where the hero itself may have a nice effect, but the hero may not actually be very good. So once again, do a check and make sure the heroes are good before you build them. And lastly, one last thing I just want to mention is that, especially at the earlier stages, you aren't simply going to have enough or multiple good characters that synergize well and form a very complete team, right? And that's completely natural. So at the earlier stages of the game, honestly, sometimes you may just clump up 2 random damage dealers together and 3 random supports together and form a kind of mishmash of random characters to form a team, right? And that's honestly perfectly fine. when it comes to specific damage type content, things like Planar Rifts or Seven Sages of Luli, this is more mid-game content because you do need a good amount of heroes across different damage types to form these teams, and so there's no need for you guys to rush this. And by the time you reach that stage of the game, I think you guys will know by yourself how to form a good team and without any external advice. So yeah, just a pretty quick one. This video is primarily targeted towards newer players who I think need this advice the most. And that's all we have for today, so I'll see you guys next time.